The Puzzle Jug.
Chapter 7.
The Governor's Proposal. Monday, November 24th, 1856. Most mornings, before the sun caught up with him, Gregg climbed to his usual place in the village cemetery, situated on the ridge overlooking his town. He'd stood there for countless mornings, ignoring the pre-dawn swarms of summer insects, peering past the low-lying fog rolling off Horse Creek, and squinting through wind-whipped ice flurries. The soles of his boots had worn a bare spot next to the final resting place of a friend he hadn't met until after his death. Gregg always found his place next to the grave of a child who had been discovered, alone and feverish, when the train stopped in the village. Finding no papers or family about him, and despite the efforts of the mill doctor, he succumbed within a day, without ever regaining his senses. The passing called up the leftover grief for all the children lost through accident, illness, or otherwise in the Graniteville population. Together they mourned the boy along with their own purloined kin, deeply and profoundly. After much consideration given to his final resting place by a group of grief-scarred mothers, they settled on nestling him in the same earth that held what was remaining of their own. They also set to carving a cedar cross with the inscription, "The Little Boy." It was a commemoration that constantly reinforced its pathos. For 2 years he'd been lying up there, looking down in death on a village he never saw in life. The little boy and Gregg had become bound together as two orphans abandoned by their parents. Neither of them could remember where they were headed before their folks vanished. Only that this square of dirt, where they met each morning, was the place the unnameable force running the engine of time arranged for them. Several hours before Gregg took his position on the ridge, oil lamps were already glowing in the kitchens of the mill workers' houses. No matter how early he arrived to stand watch in the morning, others, overseers and machinists, were already at work inside his monstrous mill, organizing daily tasks, lubricating gears, inspecting carding machines, and aligning the thread on the spinning frames. The doffers cleaned away the ever-present lint and dust that threatened to fuel a blaze capable of annihilating the mill. The firemen lit the steam boilers, carefully gauging the pressure as it built to power the mill. By the time the rest of the workers arrived, Gregg's grand project was ticking along, just as he had envisioned. Clockwork. He wanted his mill people to understand that each one was worth more to him than merely laborers. They were families, with children who needed schooling, and wives who wanted more for their boys than a never-ending row to pound. So he built homes for his people that were simple yet sturdy, arranged in straight lines on either sides of a well-maintained road. Ever since he trailed after his Uncle Jacob in hopes of finding one with his name brandished into it, William Gregg had discovered that dignity began at the doorstep. He constructed a church in his mill village, which they could attend to their spiritual needs, and instituted laws that kept alcohol out of its boundaries. This wasn't charity. It was his inheritance he was sharing with them, a legacy he'd forged inside his tiny silver mines, picking away at the metal walls to cobble together shiny baubles for the bourgeois of Charleston. Next month would mark 11 years since Gregg had secured the charter from this very same General Assembly to establish his Graniteville Manufacturing Company. He had opened his pitch by describing the appalling conditions of white workers in northern mills, locked in overcrowded, unsanitary hellholes, packed like sardines into filthy tenements, exploited until they expired, only to be replaced by another hapless soul. He watched as pity flickered on the edges of the legislators' mouths, creeping to their eyes before their hands began to fidget restlessly on the table.
Gentle sirs, how can we be complicit in these atrocities heaped upon our fellow men?
He asked, his voice heavy with reproach.
For those Yankee mills enslave white men, while they heap shame upon us for our labor practices.
Before they could scramble for an answer, he relieved them of their discomfort, unveiling his vision for a model mill village in Graniteville. Gregg painted a picture of hope, stressing how their support would uplift poor whites, if not their economic equals, surely their brethren in Christ. He offered them a simple path to redemption, invest in his plan, and they could transform luckless dirt farmers and idle men into productive citizens, working in a clean, well-constructed factory with housing, schools, and a decent square of land for their families. As a final flourish, he appealed to their pride.
Our state, our beloved South Carolina, has the opportunity to become a beacon of progress. We can elevate our stature to a place so all others look to us for guidance as we forge a new model of prosperity rooted in our Southern values. We can do this together.
His persuasive arguments and detailed plans convinced the legislators that the true strength of his Graniteville lay in his self-appointed guardianship of these people. As he finally reached the steps of the State House, he paused for just a moment before he entered as one of them. For the first time, he'd be on the other side. He'd cast his lot with some and argue with others. Gregg thought of the planters. Many had sat beside, hosted at dinners, and conferred with at the agricultural club. They were hot with ideas about expansion, about adding more fields and more slaves, convinced that more hands in the dirt meant more wealth. Even now, a decade later, they couldn't really imagine the South that he was birthing in Graniteville. They were blind to the very thing that could set them free. More bodies in chains was not the answer. They still didn't see how the mills could change everything, didn't understand that wealth wasn't just in land, but in what could be built upon it. He realized his real work was only starting, but at least he had a dynamic example of a South that could rise on its own legs. A smartly dressed Negro attendant opened the door for Gregg, greeting him with a polite, "Welcome," and "Good morning." The hall buzzed with newly elected regional representatives from across the state. Gregg, assuming he was early, was startled to find it already packed to overflowing. Scanning the room, he spotted newspaper reporters mingling with the crowd, seated in spots clearly meant for delegates. Their presence was unmistakable. Though they fancied themselves blending in among the assemblymen, their rumpled suits betrayed them as scavengers sniffing out gossip rather than giving space to legitimate business. Gregg took their reporting with a grain of salt and a healthy dose of skepticism. Several had staked out the front, scribbling into notebooks or sketching the chaos of the gathering. On closer inspection, Gregg noticed a few wore badges or ribbons identifying them as press, granting them access to the assembly. Behind him, one reporter moved with intense focus, scanning faces as if weighing their worth, leaning in to snatch bits of whispered conversation. It was clear the pack was jockeying for the best vantage point. Then Gregg spotted Richard Yaden, his longtime friend and the only newspaperman in South Carolina he trusted. After the frenzy of preparing the mill, his harried train ride from Aiken to Columbia, and the flood of memories the capital city stirred in him, Gregg had completely forgotten Richard would be here. He felt a twinge of embarrassment. He'd been so caught up in his own business, he hadn't fully prepared for the public service role to which he'd been elected. The two hadn't yet had the chance to talk about the uproar surrounding Edgefield's humiliating contribution to the U.S. Congress, Preston Brooks. Gregg disliked Brooks intensely. He was a bully who cried "duel" at the slightest offense, only to withdraw his challenge before facing his opponent on the field. Last May, Brooks had nearly killed Senator Charles Sumner, bludgeoning him to a bloody pulp on the Senate floor. For this, he'd been celebrated in the press, even receiving new gutta-percha canes as gifts to replace the one he'd broken over the unconscious Sumner. Likely, some of those came from the same journalists now occupying the delegates' seats. Revolting. Besides a few hastily written letters, Gregg and Yaden had been out of touch for nearly a year. It had been a decisive one at that. They'd first made each other's acquaintance during a barbecue at Middleton Place in the early 40s. Gregg wandered away from the larger crowd, looking for shelter from the ravings of the electric-haired Senator, John C. Calhoun. The old man's spooky countenance was a perpetual cold, unemotional one, ringed by a corona of wiry hair. Calhoun wore his nickname as the Haunted Prophet well. When Gregg ducked behind a ligustrum that had been fashioned into either a swan or a dragon, he couldn't tell which, he immediately recognized Richard Yaden as the publisher of the Charleston Daily Courier, who was hiding behind the leafy creature as well. Yaden's broad-minded unionist perspectives appealed to Gregg, and he found his newspaper's reporting more informative than the one-sided rhetoric of the Mercury. Despite Calhoun's maniacal diatribes droning in the distance, neither Yaden or Gregg distrusted the North. From that very first meeting, the two men had been engaged in an ongoing conversation about the many reasons the South was failing to achieve the economic heights of the North. They lamented in their shared beliefs that the South would be left behind if agriculture overshadowed industry. Poor whites all over the state were on the verge of revolution, streaming out in droves to northern factories over the reality that slavery suppressed wages and choked off job opportunities for free laborers. After Yaden built his summer house less than a quarter-mile from Gregg's Kalmia Land mansion on the hilltop in Aiken, they'd spent many evenings strategizing about the ways in which Gregg's village might bust up the elite caste system by employing only free white laborers at his mill. In a strange twist of fate, Yaden was elected to represent St. Philip's and St. Michael's parishes at the same time as Gregg was selected for Edgefield. The 42nd General Assembly was a first either of them had attended. Gregg waved his handkerchief over the heads of the men and called out loudly,
Yaden! Look here, Yaden! Over here!
Yaden spotted him and, with equal enthusiasm, motioned for him to proceed as he animatedly pointed to a chair over which he'd spread his waistcoat. Sliding in between the shifting congregation, Gregg finally reached the area on the right side of the room, where Yaden had saved a seat for him. The two friends heartily embraced each other.
It's wonderful to see you, my friend.
Shooing off a younger man over to the next seat, Yaden slapped him on the back.
William, come on over here. I knew you'd be here. And you probably had no idea it would be this crowded,
he said.
I must admit I was dawdling along. I was taking in the sights to such an extent that I must have completely lost track of the time.
Yaden moved close to Gregg, and his face rearranged itself in an expression that was both amused and resigned.
Oh, you're not late, my friend. The line to get in here started coalescing hours ago on the porch. The place has been overrun with every reporter in the state licking their chops for a juicy headline.
Why? What's going on?
The quizzical look Gregg shot him left Yaden with no doubt. It was true that he hadn't been privy to the tavern and club gossip. That wasn't a surprise, as he rarely knew William to take a drink.
You really don't have the faintest notion, do you?
Gregg had arrived exactly at the appointed time. He'd set out thinking this was a meeting like any other, where elected officials convene and, occasionally, discuss the affairs of their state, only to be faced with a clamoring horde and a surplus of reporters occupying every seat.
I'm sure you'll find the governor's speech exceedingly interesting.
What are you talking about?
Yaden pulled Gregg towards him, and they sat down together.
On the other hand, probably more distressing than not, since it will surely position South Carolina as a seething pool of fire eaters and soul drivers, even more than we actually already are.
Deep furrows gathered above Gregg's eyebrows. He hadn't expected this to be his first experience in the State House. He'd been completely obsessed with the management of his mill and hadn't really taken the social temperature of his district. He'd cast his vote 3 weeks ago for Buchanan instead of Fremont. He knew he wouldn't be able to justify backing a fully abolitionist agenda against the rustic beliefs of his constituents.
I don't know why I thought the election of Buchanan would buy us some time for the insanity of this year to calm down to a slow boil,
Gregg said, shaking his head. He naively believed their thinking would be pulled forward by the natural progress of evolution. The crowd quieted as Governor James Adams, a Yale-educated planter wearing a full white beard and a too-tight cravat, appeared at the front of the hall. He always looked to Gregg as if he was wearing the hair that was supposed to be growing on the top of his head, on his face. Adams seemed unusually flushed for a cool day in late November, as if the combined heat and squirming of the men gathered before him had raised his internal temperature to that of a fever. Gregg could make out the beads of perspiration dancing on his forehead and running in one single rivulet past his left ear. The governor stepped up on the platform, flanked by two aides, and seemed to gain a little bit more confidence as he tried to nonchalantly dab his bald head before laying the papers in his hand down on the lectern. He looked all in the world like a country preacher getting ready to deliver his Sunday sermon.
Honorable members of the Assembly, the time has come for us to convene and deliberate on the matters of this state.
Adams relaxed into the practiced formalities of calling a session to order, and the formerly unsettled crowd sank into a strangely silent lull.
From the looks of this chamber, I can surmise the gist of the proposal I intend to announce today has already circulated among some of you. You have most certainly confabulated about it before arriving here at this epicenter of legislative parley.
Gregg shifted his eyes toward Yaden.
Apparently I am the last to know.
Yaden lifted his eyebrows and shoulders simultaneously, in concert with his famous one-sided smile.
So let us get right to the meat of the subject, shall we?
Adams took the opportunity to bask in the hears and the huzzahs that overtake the room before raising his hand to request quiet.
We are in assembly here today in a time of profound uncertainty for our beloved homeland and the providential institution that sustains our very existence.
Adams brushed his fingers across his eyebrows as if he was delivering a eulogy instead of a state address.
The consumption of our cotton has steadily increased and will, in a few years, exceed our ability to supply that need. This sad situation does not proceed from want of land on which to grow it, but from want of able hands to cultivate it. The truth is, gentlemen, that the South is under siege from the North. They profit from our cotton and labor while criticizing us for the system that provides the goods enriching them.
Gregg slid his eyes sideways to Yaden, who stared between his knees at the floor.
I don't see a moral outrage from them about the exploitation of the East Indies, where fertile lands are worked by cheap, coerced labor, nor do they seem eager to criticize France for promoting agricultural expansion in Algeria under similar conditions.
Adams wandered out from behind the podium, leaving the safety of his structured outline behind.
I present this query to you.
Adams thrust his neck forward, scanning the faces of the crowd like a sea captain checking the horizon.
If these practices are accepted globally to sustain economic growth, why should the South be vilified for seeking to strengthen its labor force?
Either agreement or opposition buzzed around the room. Gregg couldn't tell which.
Yet across our territories, abolitionists assault our particular brand of society when they say nothing about how labor results in profits around the world. They have no conception our lot stems from the union of two unequal races we inherited and blossoms into the fine lives they enjoy.
The fevered look had returned to Adams' face.
They cannot conceive that we have embraced the role bequeathed to us by our ancestors to civilize and Christianize the savages in our midst. They do not leave their fine abodes to visit our homes, or step off their pristine brick roads to walk the fields of our plantations. They merely pontificate from their hollow, whitewashed buildings in Philadelphia and Boston, and send out assassins to murder settlers seeking a new life on the lawless plains of Kansas, where scoundrels like John Brown hack to pieces the innocent in the name of false righteousness.
Sweat was now dripping from the governor's white beard, and Gregg was transfixed by the drops as they slapped upon the wooden floor.
It was this very hypocrisy that spurred our own Preston Brooks to reply to Sumner's insult to our honor with the business end of a gutta-percha cane.
More huzzahs reverberated throughout the hall at the mention of the attack, with a few shouts of, "Beat 'em again!" and "Beat 'em every day!" coming from the back of the room.
Agriculture is the foundation of our lives here. It is our birthright.
Adams raised his voice to be heard over the racket.
Let us, therefore, act decisively to ensure that this foundation is fortified by every necessary measure.
The governor's hands were now sweeping out dramatically from the vicinity of his heart, in a timed waltz to accompany his words.
Let us, therefore, be bold in our mandate to exalt the South itself to higher hopes and purposes. It is perhaps our most sacred obligation to press it forward to a perpetuity of progress. This oath of ours can be accomplished in but one way, and in one way alone.
Gregg could tell that Adams was purposefully fanning the angry fire in the bellies of certain men in the hall ahead of his final announcement. Gregg quickly turned around to gauge the responses of the men behind him. Some of them maintained a flattened expression, not betraying any real opinion behind their faces. A few others were nodding solemnly. The majority were obviously holding their enthusiasm in check until Adams lets go with a final punchy finish.
Gentlemen, I propose that the way forward for us...
The governor narrowed his eyes and allowed himself the luxury of an exaggerated pause. Then, straightening up his body and raising his head towards the ceiling, he continued,
is to reopen the African slave trade.
Fully half of the crowd jumped to their feet in support of the governor's startling statement. The hall was a cacophony of competing sounds as a few men slapped each other on the back, and the reporters fairly scaled anyone or anything in their way to be the first to break the story. Even though Gregg knew full well the path Adams was treading, the shock of hearing the words spoken aloud in this hall of law registered plainly on his face. Yaden, meanwhile, continued his unbroken staring contest with the floor, just as he had been doing since the speech began. Gregg stood and began searching the faces of what he estimated to be well over 100 men, trying to discern whether they were truly behind this madness or merely reacting in shock. He noticed the young man Yaden had earlier told to move along, now seated beside him. They had skipped pleasantries and the usual introductions, both swept up in the frenetic atmosphere. He was much younger than Gregg or Yaden, with a full head of reddish blonde hair. He now sat silent and still in the midst of the chaos, his eyes closed as if in prayer. Then the young man lifted his head, opened his eyes, and revealed a blue so oracular, Gregg's breath caught in his throat. As Gregg observed him, so youthful in appearance he seemed barely out of his teens, an abrupt premonition engulfed him. His perception was sucked down into the silver tunnel of infinity he had first stumbled upon as a boy. His bones stiffened, and he could hear the blood rushing in his temples. Within those eyes, Gregg was struck with a lightning bolt from the future. His own sons trapped in this mire of stagnation, his grandchildren and their descendants clawing for generations to uncuff the shackles laid upon them by the words Adams had uttered here today. The only response Gregg could manage was a sharp, whispered exclamation.
He can't be serious.
The young representative let his head fall, solemnly examining his fingernails, as Gregg sank back into his chair.
I disagree. I believe the governor is quite serious, sir.
The young man replied. Gregg looked around the room again. A few men were gathering their belongings, ready to leave. Others were casually offering each other cigars. The boy, representative stranger, turned his preternatural blue eyes toward Gregg again, stood, and began loading a few papers into a worn leather satchel. Gregg, still caught between dimensions, hung in the space where Yaden remained frozen in his downward stare, and this impossibly young representative was distilling the entire speech into a bitter truth.
The governor of the state of South Carolina just proposed we ignore a federal law.
Gregg said, his voice heavy with disbelief.
I cannot accept that any man who really considers this suggestion would actually carry it forward in reality.
Oh, just you wait and see, sir. One day, and I don't imagine it'll be too far in the future, some foolish lickspittle will see this as his personal invitation to extract as many souls from Africa as he can cram on his death ship.